Jake Mitchell, a 24-year-old paramedic, worked every shift with the same silent ambulance driver. Frank Weber, 58 years old, never spoke beyond yes and no. But that night, during the city's biggest traffic accident, Jake saw something in Frank's hands that would change his life forever. How does a man drive an ambulance silently for 12 years without anyone discovering the secrets of his past? And when that secret is revealed, how does it save not just one life, but an entire career? Welcome to our channel. Here we share real-life inspired stories that will deeply move you every day. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell. And for our loyal viewers, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Let's see how far our stories reach. As you can see in this story, true heroism sometimes lies hidden within people who appear ordinary. People like Frank Weber choose quiet service instead of choosing to be in the spotlight. Our day was spent telling you this beautiful story. For more stories like this and for our stories to end happily, support us by subscribing to the channel and liking and sharing the video. Tell us in the comments, have you ever met someone who seemed ordinary but had extraordinary abilities? Until we meet in our next story, stay healthy. Metro City Ambulance Service's night shift was always busy. When Jake Mitchell started this job as a freshly graduated paramedic, he was assigned Frank Weber as his driver. Frank was one of the company's most experienced drivers. No accidents in 12 years, knew every street, but barely spoke a word. During their first shifts, Jake tried making conversation with Frank. When he asked, "How's it going, Frank?" Frank would just nod. To the question, "How long have you been doing this job?" he'd get, "Long time," as an answer. Jake figured Frank was just an introvert. But as time passed, Jake started noticing strange things. Frank wasn't just driving the ambulance, he moved like he knew every part of it. When Jake asked questions about medical equipment, Frank always had the right answers. And strangest of all, Frank never seemed affected by blood or injury scenes. "Frank, did you work in healthcare before?" Jake asked once. Frank simply said, "No," and changed the subject. After working together for 6 months, Jake was certain Frank wasn't a normal ambulance driver. Once, they were transporting an elderly man having a heart attack. While Jake performed CPR, Frank watched the patient in the mirror. "Approach from the left side, the veins are better there," Frank suddenly said. Jake was surprised. "What did you say?" "Nothing," Frank quickly replied. "Just focus on traffic." But Frank was right. When Jake changed his position, the CPR became much more effective and they managed to save the patient. Another night, when they encountered a severely injured motorcycle rider, Jake was assessing the patient for suspected internal bleeding. Frank turned from the steering wheel to look at the patient. "Spleen," Frank said quietly. "What?" Jake asked. "Internal bleeding, most likely from the spleen," Frank repeated. "We need to move fast." Jake looked at Frank suspiciously, but when they arrived at the hospital, the doctors made exactly the diagnosis Frank had stated. The patient was rushed into emergency spleen surgery. That night Jake bombarded Frank with questions. "How did you know? How could you speak so confidently?" Frank just said, "Experience," and remained completely silent for the rest of the night. On a cold Thursday night in March, at exactly 2:47 a.m., an emergency call came from dispatch. All ambulances, multi-vehicle accident on I-95. At least 15 injured, 3 critical cases. Emergency backup needed. Jake felt an adrenaline rush. This would be the biggest emergency of his career. Frank calmly got into the ambulance and turned on the siren. Chaos reigned at the accident scene. 5 cars had collided, a truck had overturned, and injured people were scattered all over the road. Fire department teams were extracting victims from vehicles, police were directing traffic, and 3 ambulances were trying to handle more casualties than they could manage in a full shift. Jake ran to the first victim, a young woman, unconscious and severely injured. While checking vital signs, Frank also got out of the ambulance and started surveying the area. Jake thought Frank was quietly observing as usual. But Frank wasn't observing. He was assessing. "Jake." There was an authority in Frank's voice that Jake had never heard before. "Leave that woman, check the guy by the truck right now." Jake was shocked. "Frank, this woman." That woman is stable but looks severely injured. The guy by the truck is dying from internal bleeding. Now." Due to the urgency in Frank's tone, Jake ran to the truck. There was a middle-aged man, conscious but pale and sweating. Jake quickly measured vital signs. Pulse 140, blood pressure low. "How did you know?" Jake asked. Instead of answering, Frank started unloading medical supplies from the ambulance. But he wasn't just unloading supplies, he was organizing them just like an experienced EMT would. While other ambulances were dropping off victims at the hospital, Jake and Frank were transporting the 3 most critically injured patients. In the back of the ambulance, while Jake was checking one patient's blood pressure, another began having a seizure. "Frank, we need to get to the hospital fast," Jake shouted in panic. But Frank pulled the ambulance over. "What are you doing?" Jake asked. Frank jumped into the back of the ambulance next to Jake. He looked at the seizing patient and quickly checked his pulse. "This isn't a post-traumatic seizure," Frank said with certainty. "Hypoglycemia. Diabetic emergency." "You're an ambulance driver, Frank. You can't make patient assessments." Frank looked at Jake. For the first time, his eyes held not just silence, but deep wisdom. "Jake, trust me. Give him sugar." Jake hesitated, but remembered all the strange knowledge Frank had shown over the past 6 months. He took the glucose ampoule and injected it into the patient. Within 30 seconds, the patient came out of the seizure and opened his eyes. Jake looked at Frank breathlessly. "How did you know? Who are you?" Frank took a deep breath. After 12 years, he realized it was time to tell the truth. "Dr. Frank Weber, former Army Medical Corps. 15 years as a combat medic, then 8 years as an ER doctor." Jake's world spun. "What?" "Jake, I was an ambulance driver before I became a doctor. After I became a doctor, I continued being an ambulance driver. Because this is where real medicine happens." After dropping off the injured at the hospital, Frank and Jake sat inside the ambulance. For the first time, Frank was talking. "I did 3 tours in Iraq. Then 2 tours in Afghanistan. Started as a combat medic, then the Army sent me to medical school. I specialized in trauma surgery." Jake listened silently. "After returning from war, I worked in big hospitals. In Boston, in Chicago. I was a very good doctor, Jake. But I never felt like I was practicing real medicine." "What do you mean by real medicine?" Frank turned toward the ambulance window facing outside. "Real medicine is being with people in their worst moments. Not in fancy hospital rooms, but in the middle of the street. Saving lives with basic equipment, not with luxury." "Then why do you work as an ambulance driver? Why not as a doctor?" Frank smiled. Jake was seeing him smile for the first time. "Because Jake, I don't need to prove myself anymore. At 23, I performed neck surgery on a battlefield. At 35, I did heart transplants in civilian life. Now I'm 58 and I just want to help people. But this is waste. You could save so many more people as a doctor." Frank turned to Jake. "Jake, how many people have we saved together in the last 6 months?" Jake thought. "At least 50 to 60. "How many patients do hospital doctors see per day?" "Maybe 20 to 30. And before they see patients, we get those people to the hospital alive. Who's doing the more critical work?" Jake understood. Frank wasn't just an ambulance driver. He was a true expert in field medicine. The next night, when Frank and Jake started their shift, the dynamic between them had completely changed. Jake now saw Frank not just as a driver, but as a mentor. "Frank, would you teach me real field medicine?" Jake asked. Frank nodded. "Jake, you're already a good paramedic. But yes, I have things I can teach you." Their first call was to an apartment where an elderly man was having a heart attack. While Jake applied his usual protocol, Frank began guiding him. "Jake, look at the patient's color. This isn't just a heart attack, there's probably arrhythmia too. Check the EKG." When Jake connected the EKG, Frank was proven right. The patient was having both a heart attack and a dangerous rhythm disorder. How did you know? Skin color, breathing pattern, and most importantly the patient's posture. Cardiac patients instinctively position themselves in specific ways. On the way to the hospital, Frank began teaching Jake field assessment techniques. In hospitals, they have all kinds of fancy machines, Jake. But in the field, you'll make diagnoses with just your eyes, hands, and experience. A month later, a major apartment fire broke out on the other side of the city. Jake and Frank were called to the scene along with other emergency services. The fire had been extinguished, but many people were affected by smoke inhalation. Jake knew it was time to put Frank's teachings into practice. The first patient was a middle-aged woman, conscious but having trouble breathing. Jake used the assessment method Frank had taught him. Skin color normal, but chest movement shallow. Probably minor smoke inhalation, but no complications. Jake made his assessment. Frank nodded. Correct. Next. The second patient was more challenging. A young man, unconscious and breathing with difficulty. Jake put his hands on the patient's chest and applied the technique Frank had taught him. Chest movement asymmetric. Problem in the right lung. Probably pneumothorax. Frank smiled proudly. Perfect diagnosis, Jake. What do we need to do? Emergency to hospital, and needle decompression should be ready on the way. Jake's self-confidence was growing. Under Frank's guidance, he was becoming a real emergency medicine expert. 3 months later, at the city's emergency services annual meeting, the cases Frank and Jake worked on received recognition. They were awarded as the ambulance team with the highest survival rate. The ceremony, Jake took the microphone. This success isn't just mine. It wouldn't have been possible without my partner Frank Weber. Frank taught me not just paramedic work, but real medicine. The paramedics and EMTs in the audience applauded. But a doctor in the crowd stood up. Frank Weber? Dr. Frank Weber? From Boston Memorial. Frank stood up sheepishly. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from Boston Memorial ER. Dr. Weber, I worked with you 10 years ago. You're a legend there. Why are you working as an ambulance driver? Frank took the microphone and spoke publicly for the first time in 12 years. Dr. Chen, thank you for remembering me. But I didn't change careers. I'm still practicing medicine. I just changed locations. Instead of hospital rooms, I work in the middle of the street. 6 months later, Frank and Jake had become the city's most successful ambulance team. Under Frank's mentorship, Jake had gained expertise in the paramedic field. Frank had transitioned from silent heroism to public recognition. One evening, after their shift ended, they were sitting in a diner. Frank, can I ask you something? Sure, Jake. Do you ever regret leaving your career in big hospitals to become an ambulance driver? Frank took a sip of his coffee and smiled. Jake, in Boston I saw 2,000 patients a year. Here we save 1,500 people a year. Do you know what the difference is? What? The patients in Boston were already stable when they came to me. The people we save here reach the hospital alive because of us. Which is more valuable? Jake understood. Frank hadn't just made a job change. He had decided to practice medicine in its real form. One more thing, Jake, Frank added. You became an amazing paramedic. But what makes me most proud is that you didn't just learn technical skills. You learned to practice medicine with compassion. Jake smiled proudly.